Okay, we're going to pick up again with the Avatamsaka Sutra. We just finished the last of the first section of verses. And there's going to be a switch transition to the next section of verses. And probably as we read this, you'll have a kind of deja vu experience of, I think I heard this before, and that's because it is pretty much a word-for-word, character repetition of the earlier verse, and we can say a little bit about that. But we're beginning on, I think, page 13 at the bottom in the text I'm looking at, and then it goes immediately into 14 and 15. Is that right? Is that, at that time, light passed? Do you have the text online?
Yeah, they do.
Is it 13 and 14?
Yeah, at the end of 13. Right?
Okay.
Yep.
So the text says, at that time, light passed through this world and everywhere illumined 10 Buddha lamps in the east. It was also like this in the south, west, north, the 4 intermediate directions, as well as above and below. Within each of those worlds, there were billion Jambudvipas, reaching up to 1 billion ultimate form heavens. All these were clearly revealed in this light. Just as in this place one could see the Buddha, the world-honored one, seated on his lotus flower treasury lion's throne, with bodhisattvas as many as fine motes of dust in Buddha lands circumambulating him. So too, in each of those billions of Jambudvipas, there were billions of thus come ones seated in the same way. And because of the spiritual power of the Buddha, in each of the 10 directions, there was a great bodhisattva who was accomplished by bodhisattvas to the number, it was accompanied by bodhisattvas to the number of fine motes of dust in 10 Buddha lands, who came to the Buddha's place. Their names were Manjushri and then others. They came from countries called Golden Colored World and others, and the Buddhas they served were all called Unmoving Wisdom, Thus Come One, and others. At that time, in the presence of all those Buddhas, the voices of Manjushri Bodhisattva in all those places rang out in unison as they spoke verses. And then we'll go into the verse section. So, again, this is a repeat of the assembly of where they're gathering, why they're gathering. And again, they're both drawn to and bathing in this light, this illuminating brilliance of the Buddha. They go through this in a way now, I mean, they're reducing the vast listing they could give. In other parts of this text, you'll get a listing of the Buddha's names, the Bodhisattva's names, the various lands' names. In this passage, they're just saying, and others, meaning that the names, if we were to go into it, would be almost limitless and boundless. And this is, again, one of the features of this text, is that when you read it, it's very easy to pass over this content as being, I don't get it. It's really outside the grasp of the ordinary mind. And to some extent, that's precisely the point, because what the text is saying is the grasp of the ordinary mind is a limited grasp. It's not the full purchase that's available to the unattached, unbound, liberated mind. This is an expression from the Avatamsaka, the unattached, unbound, liberated mind. And so in a sense, we can take this as something beyond our ken, beyond our ability to know, without having to reject it. Or there may be aspects of it that make sense to us, but not fully. And I guess if it fully made sense to you, then you would be in this assembly almost existentially immediately in that light. Because I think we have to be clear that when we're talking about this text, this teachings, we're not talking about a kind of time-space framing that most of us use. Again, that's the bound, unliberated, attached mind that creates a kind of time and space thing, usually measured in terms of our lives, the ticking of our clocks. This is proposing something far greater. Now, even if we can't maybe explain the content of this, or certainly can't prove or show this or demonstrate this, it's just presented as this is how it is. In terms of a cultivation, you also want to look not just at the content, but at the language, the metaphor, the imagery, and the affective power or the affective thrust that it can have on you, have on me. And every time I get into this text, I'm struck by how my collapsed ordinary consciousness is challenged here. And so again, with this text, you have an exploration of time. We talked about kalpas, meaning a huge measure of time that's, it's probably inconceivable. And I remember the parallel we gave, it was something to the extent I'm trying to remember the definition of a kalpa, see if I can find that text that goes back. This being the largest measure of time. And I'm going to do a little bit of a search here to the previous. I bet neither of you remember that wonderful, this is the one that says, this is actually from another text, and it says, the Gautama Buddha once made reference to his measure of time, or the measure of, not his, let's say the measure of time to someone who's fully awakened, and it's totally outside the space that we usually deal with, and describe the duration of a kalpa, which is this measure, using a metaphor, and said if you had a huge rock that was a mile wide, a mile in what, depth, breadth, and height, what is it, depth, height, and length or something, the three measures, and it was a mile by a mile by a mile, and if you took a silk cloth and you brushed that rock one time every century, then by the time that was dissolved would be a kalpa. Yeah. So suppose, O monks, there was a huge rock of one solid mass, 1 mile long, 1 mile wide, 1 mile high, without split or flaw. And at the end of every 100 years, a person would come and rub against it a silken cloth. Then that huge rock would wear off and disappear quicker than a world period, which is the kalpa. And that's a small kalpa. There's small kalpas and medium kalpas and then asamkhya of kalpas. But of such world periods of monks, many have passed away, many hundreds, many thousands, many hundreds of thousands. And how is this possible? Inconceivable of monks. In this samsara, not to be discovered, is any first beginning of beings who are obstructed by ignorance and ensnared by craving and hurrying and hastening through this round of rebirth. So this measure that's being brought up here is just mind-blowing. By the way, this is not a Mahayana sutra I just read to you. This was from a Pali text, that description of kalpas. And the Avatamsaka just picks up on this again with what we're doing here. So on one hand, you have this huge span of time, and then you have something that's called a kashana. And a kashana is actually the opposite measure of time. It's probably the smallest measure. There's different meanings of it. One Shastra says in the space of a finger snap, there are 60 moments, there are 60 kashanas. Did you note them all? 60. So it's some incredibly, what seems to us, again, the relativity of things here, seems to us to be really small. But in this is the Mahaprajnaparamita Shastra. In this Shastra, it says, in the time it takes to snap a finger, there are 60 moments, 60 kashanas. In each kashana, the mind is born and ceases. But as it arises in a series, we know that this is a mind of desire, that a mind of anger, or a mind of delusion, a mind of belief or confidence, a pure mind, of wisdom, prajna, and of rapture. All these things can happen within this same mind, in these same moments. So some people say it's 4/5 of a second. I've seen others that say it's 1/75 of a second. One finger snap has 60. One finger, it's like, some people say it's when someone is really approaching a place where the mad mind stops, begins to cease, and begins to project out the time-space framing that we do. In your state of awareness, and initially in meditation, you can actually observe a finer and finer breaking down of time. And after a while, it's not measured in the ticks of a clock. It's measured in the movement of the mind and one's thoughts and setting ups and so forth. Those of you who have sat in meditation for a while and tried to, quote, calm the mind, realize that in the space of a single sit, it's not too far-fetched to say there are many, many, many thought occurrences. Too many to actually calculate. If you tried to write them down, you couldn't. That's just the beginning of what's going on. So it's very subtle. So time, and then of course we have the space dimension here. So one way to look at this is just say, you could say, is it true? And again, I would say that depends on what we hold to be true in our present state of mind and perception. And again, this is a very important feature of this text, and I'd say Buddhism in general, is talking about what we call out there, what we call the larger reality, is inextricably intertwined with our thoughts, our emotions, our feelings, our desires, our fears, and so on and so forth, that we are actually simultaneously observing and creating that reality. It's not something that's just given. And so what this text is seeming to say is that when one is in this state that's being described matter-of-factly, that these Buddhas and Bodhisattvas are obviously relating to, is probably not where we are now. But it's not that it's another place or another time. It's an opening of consciousness to the here and now. This that they're describing, according to the text, is the here and now. Our here and now is just a limited portion shrunk down into a kind of myopic, self-centered version of something. It's not that it's false, and it's not that this is absolutely true, but what it's saying is, as the mind changes, our understanding of time and space and actually who we are changes. So our present mind and perception, possibly you can take away from this passage of text, could be softened or humbled. And I don't mean artificially so, just for the sake of humbling, but to actually change the way we live changes the way we see and understand things. For example, just holding the 5 precepts disengages you from a lot of scatteredness and a lot of outflowing. When that scatteredness and outflowing is removed, consciousness expands, it opens up. It opens up in many dimensions. It opens up in time and space, but it also opens up the heart to compassion. And it also opens up to seeing what was there all the time but one never saw before because of the scattered consciousness, vijnana. So what we do know, though, and this is where I would build today, is relax a little bit and let the sutra work on that affective dimension, knowing that what we think is real and true and solid is always shifting, can be expanding, and it can be shrinking, and it can be actually overturned. In the scientific way of speaking, when you have a complete overturning of your perception and your understanding, your very cognitive way you imagine and see things, it's something called a paradigm shift. So you actually shift into a whole different ground of seeing and understanding. This has happened many times in human history. So I'm just going back to this and saying the Avatamsaka is pushing this envelope really much beyond what we even know of our paradigm shifts over time, that we've gone from, say, a heliocentric to a geocentric model of the universe and so forth. These are all shifting. Even in physics, we've gone from a very elementary kind of Newtonian physics now to quantum and beyond. This will continue in our lifetimes and beyond to continue. People in the future will look back on us and say, wow, they lived in the dark ages. That's wonderful. They believed in, quantum physics. How silly. Now we know it's this. So I think in a sense, and also they may look back at this time and say, oh my gosh, the nature of reality was such that it was totally interpenetrating and interrelated, and they believed there were countries and clans and tribes and egos. Wow, that's amazing they didn't extinguish themselves. And maybe they'll say, oh, it's obvious why they did extinguish themselves, because they couldn't get their thinking to match up with the overarching larger reality. So, in any event, what we know for sure, it's better to say we only know this. Rather than say we know for sure, say we know only this. That's a whole different approach. I mean, if you thought about it in a cautionary tale, what we know so far is this. That's a very different thing than say we know for sure. And I would say, to me at least, from the time I started doing science, and this is a while ago, I got embarrassed recently for that. I was describing something I learned in science when I was in the university, and people really just thought it was, not even medieval, earlier than that. But what I have picked up on, what we don't know is always far greater than what we do. So even though the field of knowledge has advanced, seemingly advanced, really are we any different than Zhuangzi's great metaphor of a frog at the bottom of the well looking up and seeing we see the whole sky because we see that circle of blue. And we get up a little higher and the circle's a little bigger and we think, oh, now we see for sure. And then the frog is drawn out in a bucket and looks around 360 degrees and actually is dumbstruck. I'm not so sure where we are in the well, but I'm pretty sure we're in the well someplace. And the reason I say this is that the world would not be in the state it is right now if we were on the top of the well and we saw everything 360 degrees. So enough on that. It's interesting, too, that an ancient text said that what we can know of that, can only ultimately be accomplished by accomplishing this, the person. So again, while science and technology is interesting and it provides us a great deal of insight and knowledge as to the workings, ultimately we have to understand that even science and technology is a limited function of this, of the workings of our mind. Change the parameters and the depth of the mind, and science and technology would go in wholly different directions. And at some point, only through the accomplishment of this can we actually have an immediate encounter with that. So that's just some thought. At the same time, there is a lure when we hear this to fall into two extremes, which the verse will talk about coming up, avoid the two extremes. One extreme to this is just to fall into a kind of nihilism, a kind of, oh, well, we can't know, it's hopeless, why bother? And to sink in a kind of amoral relativism and throwing in the towel. The other is to jump into a sort of a fundamentalism and eternalism and just insist that this is the truth, it's unchanging, it's unvariable, and we know it, and it's been given to us by choose your source. The book, the God, the sage, tradition, our culture, whatever, my school, my major, it tells me everything I need to know about reality. So sometimes it's good to study the classics. There's a French philosopher who was a bit of iconoclast, but I kind of like Voltaire. And Voltaire had a wonderful line. He said, uncertainty is really an uncomfortable position. And he's hitting on this. But then he said, but certainty is absurd. And that's the humble attitude I'm talking about. Uncertainty, where we have to be if we're honest, is an uncomfortable position. But certainty is absurd. And I think what he's suggesting here is something that Emerson also suggested, only to the extent that we are unsettled, is there any hope for us? Same kind of thought. And I think you find this, if you read the Avatamsaka with that light, that it's unsettled, it's uncertain, it's stirring up, that you can actually then get something. There's an interesting commentary I read from my teacher tonight, which every once in a while I'll bring in commentary that he has on this. And at the time, I can remember this, we would have this passage that we read tonight. Maybe some of you didn't have this thought, so now I'm going to mess with your minds the way we used to think in the 70s. Their names were Manjushri. Their names were Manjushri? It wasn't saying his name was Manjushri, it's their names. Wait a minute, how many Manjushris are there? So one of us in the assembly at that time would say, Master would say, Yo meo ante. Anybody have any questions? And one of us would say, Master, did somebody make a mistake here? These Manjushri Bodhisattvas. And the Master would say, no, that's a mistake. And then we'd say, I thought there was only one. And he said, but basically there's not even one. Huh? There's only great wisdom. Oh, but he said, how many are there ultimately? He said, sometimes he would just play, but this particular night he said, that's a really good question. And I'm reading your commentary now from that night. The text speaks of Manjushri Bodhisattva being in every place. Even so, there's only one Manjushri Bodhisattva. So, what's going on here? Yet, in every Dharma assembly, Manjushri Bodhisattva manifests a body to act on or in the influential assembly. Since he manifests in that way, couldn't you say that there were many Manjushri Bodhisattvas? Yes, you could say that. But you could also say that his original substance, his original body, is just one, and that his transformation bodies are limitless and boundless. Also, we're stretching now. Transformation bodies, what this? It's not necessary for him to move to create his transformation bodies. It's just that right in the original place, he's complete with all his transformation bodies. Original substance and all his transformation bodies are two and yet not two. Remember the verses last section that came up, the one and the many? And this again is an Avatamsaka theme. And so the commentary continues. Although you see there are so many, there's really only one. So at this time, I can remember back in those years, you're kind of sitting there, it's 8:30 at night, you're like, whoa. And you could say, well, back in the 60s and 70s, we thought we were pretty far out. Our minds were pretty open and expanded. But here it was like, wow, how can that be? And then he says, it can be liked. Let me give you an example. Piru. It likened to moonlight, which can stand for the Dharma body of the Buddha. Every place that has water has the moonlight reflected in it. When we see all these reflections, is it really the case? Are there that many moons? No, there's just one moon. But that one moon can manifest in all different places, and in all places it's still just one. Bodhisattvas are like this. The many are just the one is just the many, there's no difference between them. So then you're going, wow. Because it's a metaphor that I know, like up in Maine, if I go out, there's creeks, there's ponds, there's puddles of the rain, and there's a lake. And if I go out after the rain clouds are gone, the moon is in every one of those bodies. And yet, it's only one moon, but this is like, oh, okay, I kind of get that. And then he says another example would be a room full of mirrors. When you stand in the room, your body's reflected in all the mirrors. Your body gets divided up and reflected on all the mirrors. Does that mean your real body doesn't exist? No. What appears in the mirrors is just a reflection, and the body you have doesn't disappear. Yet, for as many mirrors as there are, a corresponding number of bodies will manifest. This is another way to show you how Manjushri Bodhisattva makes wonderful use of his spiritual penetrations to appear everywhere. Now, the thing is, you have to remember these are metaphors. It's not saying it's exactly that. So in his commentary, what the master is doing is stretching us, using metaphor and analogy to help bridge from what we do understand to what we don't understand. But to take it literally is also to miss the point. So then you're left wondering. And I want to say this. We seek for certainty, but wondering is almost the mother of real learning. Not so much the search for certainty, but the wondering. And the wondering always leaves open the possibility that we could grow and change in our thinking if we can let go of wanting to be fixed and settled. And this sense of the text is, again, what I mentioned previously. We speak of impermanence as a negative thing, as a disappointment. But it's right within impermanence that this wonder and this curiosity can have full room to move. And actually, if you're a good student and a thinking person, you kind of chafe and balk when it's given as fixed and certain. There's something that challenges, and I think that's a healthy thing. And Bertrand Russell was the one, I think he was one that says, seek certainty in everything and then distrust it. And there's this kind of tension that's there. But in the impermanence of things, it's actually somewhere in there is whatever we call truth. It's not in the permanence, because everything in our experience that we can know and get access to is changing. It's in flux. So as soon as we stop it, as soon as we fix it, it might be satisfying, but it's unreal. It doesn't measure up to the way things are. And this unattached, unbound, liberated mind it's a free and easy, relaxed flow to it, and yet it's not anxiety and it's not outflowing. So this is a very, very interesting quality. Just intellectually, I think, if you didn't think of it any other way, to have this kind of openness of mind allows for constant learning and discovery. Anyhow, I will pause there tonight. The next section coming up is quite interesting. I will read the verse, and then if there's time, we'll go into tonight. I think Jinchuan is going to talk tonight. Are you going to talk about the first verse?
I think I might talk about what you talked about.
Okay.
You poked at me and I thought
So as a teaser, the trailer for maybe tonight, but next week, in case some of you are interested in love, you might not be. It's like, who needs it? But when I was growing up, I was told that's all you need. All you need is love. All you need is love. And now we're going to talk about love, but from the view of the Avatamsaka, which is somewhat different than the Beatles. But here's the verse. Living beings lacking wisdom are injured and poisoned by the thorn of love. What is the Buddha Dharma for? It's to lead people to Bodhi. Now I've changed this around from you see in your text, to cause people to seek Bodhi is what the Buddha Dharma is for. I reversed it. So there's a very interesting relationship. Living beings lacking wisdom are injured and poisoned by this thorn. Then the verse goes to something else. So what is the Buddha Dharma for? It's to cause beings to seek Bodhi. I'm suggesting here the first two verses are about diagnostic of a malady of living beings. They're injured and poisoned. The second two verses are the prescriptive remedy that's being presented, what the Dharma is for. So this is a really important passage, and if we have time, we'll start to get into it a little bit tonight. Right now we're going to have Jin Chuan.
Uh-oh, I think we just lost the...
Here.
Okay, that's good. That's good.
It comes apart.
Yeah, it comes apart. Is it
Well,
working?
you get your little stool and I have my little stool.
Yeah.
Cool.
Good? Okay. So, good evening, everyone. I'll talk about that verse, because that's actually what I kind of prepared on in my mind, which is the teaching about love and craving, and how that, you could say, leads us to kind of confusion and delusion. And this teaching is something that's kind of very pivotal within the Buddhist tradition. As Marty said, in American society, growing up, all you need is love. Love is something that's held up so highly, and so to kind of criticize it anyway seems to be asking for trouble. People really idealize it. And so what I found is an interesting way to look at it, for me to make sense to myself, is where does that, you could say, greed or craving come from? It often first comes from a movement of lacking, of somehow not feeling sufficient inside ourselves. And I want to tell the story that I remember as the earliest time I can remember this in my conscious memory that this happened. And I think I was maybe 5 or 6. I was partly remember because Marty last week talked about the young, 6-year-old coming to talk with you. And at 5 or 6, you're very trusting. I almost think almost anything people tell you, you kind of believe. So I remember watching on TV an advertisement for peanut butter Captain Crunch. And, it had peanut butter Captain Crunch, you have Captain Crunch, and then you have this little toy that in the peanut butter Captain Crunch you can get. And I was like, oh wow, that's such a cool toy. Ooh, this looks like really good cereal. So I remember going to the shopping mall with my mom, and I saw a box of peanut butter Captain Crunch. And I kind of threw a tantrum, say, I want to get this. My mom is a mom who doesn't really let me eat, sweets. She kind of wants me to be healthy. But I really threw a fit, and so she kind of gave in. So, okay, get in your box, you have to eat it all yourself. Okay. So I remember coming home, super excited, God, peanut butter Captain Crunch. And I opened the box, I pulled out the toy, and if people know the toys in cereal boxes, they're actually pretty lousy. You look at it like, it looks like nothing on the TV. This little flips, they got much better toys than this. Like, okay, no problem, I'll eat the cereal, it's gonna be really good. I remember trying to eat the cereal, like, this tastes horrible. This tastes like artificial. But I remember the feeling like, since I fought for it so hard, I couldn't tell my mom I didn't like it, so I'd eat all of it, But in my heart, as a 5, 6-year-old kid, I think to myself, the TV lied to me. I had this deep feeling, this TV lied to me. And that experience, although it's a little bit humorous, I think is actually the experience of this sense of love or craving that we seek after. And in modern times, modern advertising is constantly trying to create that lack, with its some kind of attractive appearance, maybe somebody's, selling some kind of product with this, beautiful woman or beautiful man, handsome man, and there's no concrete relationship between two logically, but you just think, what, I want to be more like that person, and then subconsciously we have this feeling like I need that, and we, purchase it, and that's very deep in our society, which kind of creates this, maybe Marty was talking about this myopic, self-centered, desire-based relationship. And so if we really want to get free, then we have to look at this from a different vantage point, a place where we don't actually fundamentally lack. And that to me is what the Dharma kind of opened up, is that, what, I might actually have enough already. I don't need more stuff, which is not something we get in society. We usually get, you need more stuff, buy the next upgrade. It's like, what, you've got enough. You don't need to get more. And that's, I found extremely liberating, that every morning when I start out the day, I have that little vow to myself, I vow to be content and grateful. I have enough, I don't need to go out and get a lot of things. And you can actually feel the inner experience of that if you kind of reflect on those words to yourself. The thought, I have to get that. And if you just say that to yourself and feel what that feels like in the body, and you feel what kind of emotions come up around that, and the thoughts that come up around that, and how the face kind of tightens up and the body kind of starts to move. There's an excitement and a rush, but it's really unsettling if you really pay attention. It's not really that comfortable. It's actually, you're moving, rather than, what, I have enough. Just let go. And so that to me was a kind of a liberating shift. So maybe as a kind of a final story, was also later on, maybe 17, 18. And this was an interesting story because I was at that time starting to look into spirituality and meditation. And there was a woman author who wrote a book called Cloister Walk, and she went to a Catholic monastery. And when she visited this place, she and her friend talked to one of the monks. And she said she had a very strange experience, which was what? He said, the monk paid equal attention to me and my friend. And throughout my entire life, whenever I was with my friend, because she was so much more attractive than me, when we talked to a man, the man would always pay much more attention to her. So this was the first time I had somebody pay equal attention to both of us. And it was just like a shock for her. And when I was reading that, 17, 18, young man, during that time in life, you could see our desires are pretty strong. I'm saying, wow, that's an interesting idea, to say that we can be free of this craving, this kind of, maybe to a certain extent, but you can be free of that mind that just brings down objects to these objects of desire that are going to satisfy me. And I realized how limiting that was, that in our society, which really looks to wanting to be free of prejudice, treating everyone equally, that this mind of craving is actually the mind that leads to prejudice, leads to craving, leads to entanglement, leads to a kind of narrowing of consciousness. Rather, the mind that actually lets go, is content, allows people to exist for who they are, allows for real relationships. That's the path to liberation. So I thought, in terms of that verse, just some reflections about how love isn't the solution to your life's problems. Of course, love in this context isn't this kind of open-hearted loving kindness that we sometimes talk about in Buddhism. This is very technically saying, this is craving, trishna. This kind of craving based on self and attachment. So I really like a phrase in Buddhism that says, freedom, real freedom in Buddhism is not freedom to act on my desires, but it's actually a freedom from desires, or freedom from this kind of craving. No.
I had the same experience with cereal toys.
Oh,
my
really?
gosh,
Yeah, they were disappointing.
It was my first experience in loving and losing, and disappointing, and not trusting. But I was a good consumer. Spend a little time. We won't obviously penetrate this all tonight, but I think there's different ways of coming at this this text here. One is just strictly to understand, and I'll go back to the Platform Sutra on this, that love, in all its forms, is actually part of the nature. This is not some external intrusion, pollution that's brought in from the outside, but actually is a part of the zixing, the self, the original nature. So there's a very famous passage in the Platform Sutra I'll get to later, perhaps not tonight, where this is described. And just like afflictions and bodhi are along a continuum, Fannao Joshu Puti, afflictions are bodhi, this message, love is also bodhi. Okay, not as it's presenting itself, but as in its very basic substance. It's in a sense, a misrendering or a misinterpretation or misuse of the pure nature. But it arises from and returns to that pure nature. So then when you're cultivating this, it becomes very important. You are transforming something. You're transforming emotions and feelings that have come up that are part of that nature. They manifest in this way. They're moving away from the original ground in the sense that they are using it badly. But it's still the same substance. And therefore, you don't deny this, and you don't cut it off, and you don't crush it. But you have to learn how to return it to this source. So again, as we work through this, it's important psychologically to understand where this verse is going. Especially, this is what the Buddha Dharma is for, is to cause people to return to Bodhi. So in a sense, what it's saying is the teachings are nothing more than an expedient device to get us to return the light, to illumine within, and seek the fullness of this nature, the opposite of the sense of lack. Because lack is a spooking. So that being said, we go into this a little more. And I maybe just start on this tonight. Unfortunately, and I say this unfortunately, love is a very poor but understandable translation of what's coming out of this text here. This is very subtle. This I, the fourth tone, it's the I, si, suo, shang, du. You know, poison, how do they translate this? Injured by poison, thorn of love. But the I here, especially in the Chinese, has a range of meanings. And often it's because you don't get that range in just using the I here. So you have to understand, I, let me see, is that the fourth? I here is not with its normal compound would occur in these texts, which is I-gun, which is gun being root. And that's usually how it appears in the Buddhist sense. And this is referring to a particular form of I. So what you're dealing with here is you've got something we call love. And love is this huge, all-enveloping, how shall I say it, just all-encompassing quality or sensibility or faculty of the human being. I mean, it's all over the place. And in any of these texts, we have to understand how it's being used. This is being used in a particular way that has to do with what you mentioned, which is Trishna, which has to do with a kind of thirst. For example, it can be used to indicate lust. It can be used to indicate romantic infatuation, entanglements and attachments, and even obsession. This is where I, in this text, is going. But it can also be used to describe patriotism. The same word is used in compounds, or affection, or gregariousness, sociability. The expression "I how" literally means taking care of oneself, taking care of one's health. It can be used to cherish, to support. It can be used in terms of tenderness, as in nursing or in doctoring, or a mother that's comforting a child. It also, like may go to may, means an ascetic sensibility, to have a love or an appreciation for that which is beautiful in harmony. There's a wonderful expression I like, which is being the day, but also a way of time. And it means basically treasuring the time you have left. So instead of saying loving or lusting the time, treasuring the time you have left. And in the Confucian tradition, this means the time you have left to take care and serve your parents. Now, if you're thinking as a Buddhist tradition, this day is almost done. Our lives are that much less. Like fish in a operating pond, what joy is in this? And how did the rest of it goes?
Great assembly.
Great assembly. Be diligent and cultivate
vigorous.
as if saving your head.
Yeah.
Well, that's treasuring the time. It's carpe diem. So it's sort of like, but what are you? You're not living to love, and you're not just loving to live, but you're using the time you have to get free. So depending on how, and sometimes you can use it also, it's ai xiao, which means small love, which is basically kind of narcissistic self-benefiting selfishness. So this word I here has a range of meanings, and we shouldn't, and be very careful to jump in and say all these variations, all these variables along a continuum are what's being talked about in this text. It's not. This is a particular form that has to do with a craving and a thirst. And it's actually very selfish and self-centered love that's being talked about here, particularly sexual desire. But it's not. And in fact, if you were to take that and say, here's raw sexual desire, this transformed is a Buddha. I'm sorry, no, get rid of it. No, transformed, it's a Buddha, just like ice turns into water. So the question then becomes, how does one cultivate this raw sensibility into something that's awakened? I will suggest now, and we'll go into this next week, that these other forms of love that I were talking about are cultivations, are refinements of that sensibility. Going from the love of self to the love of sisters and brothers, to the love of family, to the love of students, to the love of the lifespan that you've been given, to the love of those that you are benefactors to and beneficiaries of, this kind of feeling. Even if you want to take it and say, this I talked about here is just raw passion. But when the ego is gone, then it becomes compassion. So actually, compassion is a transformation and refinement of this basic thing called passions, which are the klesha, and there you have kleshas transformed our bodhi. So I'm not going to go a great deal into this tonight, but I want to talk about this next week, because I think it could be very easily mistaken and turned into a kind of actually self-negating and self-abnegating, and even other putting off, because then you could think, oh, the root of the problem is those things that are tempting me and stirring up my passions. But the text is talking about something quite different. The problem is not those things. The problem is that your attachment and your craving and your desire unexamined is leading you to objectify and turn objects out there, including other living beings, into your objects of desire. Then when you renounce desire, you renounce the objects of your desire instead, which are those living beings. You know, and this is where it turns to not only self-loathing, but an aversion and hatred of others, thinking that they are the problem. There are many stories I can tell about this and going in my own cultivation, but I think we'll stop here for tonight because we're out of time. But I do want to spend some time on this, looking at it. So enough for tonight. Announcements? I will say one thing, just briefly, that I lost a very dear friend this week, a Dharma friend, someone who's been in my life and been mutually supporting each other for over 40-some years, very unexpectedly. And so partly it was very difficult for me to come and lecture tonight. On the other hand, it's exactly probably what we would have agreed to do at any one time, which is sharing the Dharma is a way of honoring a friendship. That being said, I'll say more about this maybe next class, and tell you who it was and how it all happened. But we're in the process now of setting up a ceremony here at the Berkeley Buddhist Monastery in honor of this person, old-time disciple of Master Hua's. And so hopefully by next Friday we'll have a date and a time, and it'll be like the bathing Buddha ceremony. It's going to be a virtual online assembly. But I just want to announce that it's happened, and a memorial and a ceremony to honor this individual will be coming up soon. So that's an announcement of something that's coming. It won't be this coming week. I suspect a week after. Have you?
We'll talk with you afterwards.
Okay,
Yeah,
but
sometime.
probably in 2 weeks. So those
Yeah.
of you who are interested and want more information, probably the website or Locke, is there some way to get in touch?
I guess they could email Berkeley Monastery.
Okay, well, we'll get the announcement out for
you can put it in the
everybody.
contact form on the berkeleymonastery.org. I think it's probably not going to be that public. I think we want to check with Marty and also check with the family and just meet ourselves.
Well, it's obviously I'm trying to let people know who
Yeah.
would be in-house and know this person, right?
Yeah. Just wondering. I just asked Marty about saying the name because I think if we don't say the name, then a lot of people might have false thinking.
Oh, okay.
Because like a senior disciple of Master Hua passed away, they'd be like, "Uh-oh," what if I start thinking?
Well, in this case, wondering is not a virtue.
Yeah.
So this is Paul Peterson. His Dharma name was Guopei. Interesting, he was a teacher at the schools for a number of years, and the name of the school that Master Hua gave was Peida, which is cultivating or sustaining virtue, and that was his Dharma name, to sustain or to train, to cultivate. So I think he was at his best when he was a teacher of young children. In any event, that's who we're talking about. So some of you who already knew, some of you didn't know. Anyhow, so we'll say more next week.
In terms of monastery schedule, we have same schedule online. So morning ceremony, meditation, followed by reflections. Afternoon recitations at 12 p.m. to potentially 1 usually. And then we have a Dharma practice Q&A on Wednesdays at 1 o'clock for those who are interested for about 45 minutes. We've been going over what happens to us after we die. I think the future one might do something on the matrix because people are asking about that. And then there's the regular sutra lectures. Thursday night, Infinite Life Sutra. Friday night, Avatamsaka. Saturday night, Verhoeven Heng Sure does a Avatamsaka lecture as well. So you're welcome to join all the activities. Anything else, Jingwei Shui?
Actually, it's more, but you can.
Yeah, you can check our online and see kind of berkeleymonastery.org. You'll see our daily schedules.
Some activities offered by DRBU.
Yeah,
Extension.
DRBU classes, extension classes, and so forth. Okay.
Actually, I thought about it. That's actually a pretty good definition of a monastery. Sheltering in place.
Yeah.
Okay, I guess do the transference.
Okay. May every living being, our minds as one and radiant with light, share the fruits of peace with hearts of goodness, luminous and bright. If people hear and see how hands and hearts can find in giving unity, may our minds awake to great compassion, wisdom, and to joy. May kindness find reward. May all who sorrow leave their grief and pain. May this boundless light dispel the darkness of their endless night. Because our hearts are one, this world of pain turns into paradise. May all become compassionate and wise. May all become compassionate and wise. Bow in respect to the Venerable Master.